Coming up now, we've got the first panel discussion of the day, and this is tackling risk mitigation in the supply chain. And it's pretty much what the whole conference is about, right? So welcome to this first panel, and please welcome your speakers, Richard Jowers of SAP, Andrea Ricciarelli, did my best there, and Tom Woodham. Welcome to your speakers. Thank you. Okay, so now Richard is Director of Value Advisory, Intelligence Spend and Business Network, SAP. Andrea, Senior Director, Digital Supply Chain. And Tom is a Management Consultant at PwC. Okay, now feel free to say more about your roles as you're answering the questions, of course. We're going to start with Tom, actually. So Tom, how can technology help with risk mitigation?
Thank you. I think, first of all, I would say technology is not the only answer. I would always say it's about your people, your processes, and your data above all else. But technology can really help, and I think where we've seen the big changes over the last few years is actually about identifying risks to you before you know they exist. And just a small example of this, I worked with a large aerospace company where they put sensors on all their parts as they sent them around the world. So they know exactly where that part is as it leaves their factory and goes out to any, what they call the advanced point out at the airports to fix planes. They know where that part is. So if it gets delayed on the way, they know. They can see that the condition when it's got there. They can see the temperature it's gone to. So everything they know about that part, so they know when it arrives, one, when it's going to arrive, and two, what condition it's in. They wouldn't have known that years ago. They would have had to inspect it when it got there, had a lot of paperwork. So I think technology can really help, but it's about thinking about what are the key risks you want to identify before they happen or as they happen so that you can build that into your processes. And then it's having your people trained so they can respond to that and do something about it.
Well, yeah, because you could say, the technology is only as good as the people using it or trying to make sense of it, right? Technology is there as a tool, but it's not a silver bullet.
That's correct. That's correct. And I think too often people think it is the silver bullet, and they'll put a technology system in and they'll say, oh, it's not working. Well, have you thought about how the people are going to use it, how the process is going to work? And so it's really about that end-to-end piece and how you stitch all that together.
Okay, great. And turning to you now, Andrea, as well. We heard a lot about agility yesterday, and it's an ongoing conversation. How important would you say agility is to differentiate, but also to mitigate risk out of business in the long term?
Yeah. We spoke about digitalization, and basically we see more and more in our customer that industry boundaries are blurring, and we see different customers operating in the industry that historically were not their industry. For example, consumer products are start delivering to final consumer their products, like Procter & Gamble, for example, delivering to final consumer their products. So moving from a wholesaler model to a direct-to-consumer model. And in that perspective, we see consumer products moving in the retail space. And as well, a retailer, if you think how disruptive have been Amazon coming on the market, we all have different expectations compared to 5-10 years ago. When we place an order, we want to know exactly when we will receive. We want to have prime services. We want to organize a return in case. So all the retailers are following and are rising. Basically, I'm trying to arrive to this bar set up by Amazon. And they organize their network to ship to final customer their products, and they are organizing returns. And so in that perspective, they are moving to the logistics service provider space. And logistics service providers are as well moving their business using new technologies, like, for example, additive manufacturing. Okay, additive manufacturing allows you to print parts according to the needs. So they are moving from owning physical inventory of their customer to producing on-demand digital inventory. And this is a radical change. And if you think that additive manufacturing and 3D printer are something far away, for example, Airbus is producing 10% of their parts thanks to additive manufacturing, just to let you understand how important it is. In this sense, logistics service providers, thanks to digitalization, are moving into the manufacturing space. We have in USA an example. UPS is building a big location with all additive manufacturing installation producing on demand the parts for their customers. And also manufacturing are changing the business. So they are shifting from selling product to selling services. Again, this is something we experience everywhere in every city. So think about services like car2go or basically bike rental. So especially new generation are not interested anymore in having a product, but they are interested in having a service. In this case, a mobility service. And also in the industry, we have some cases. For example, we have in SAP customers like Kaiser Compressor that traditionally produce compressors that start selling air compressed to their customer. Or Hilti, instead of selling drills, they sell holes to their customers. So this is a radical change. And digitalization is able to differentiate the business of every company, and it is very important to be agile and differentiate and compete into the world.
Okay, it's a good answer, comprehensive answer. We always like those. Richard, we talked a little bit there about the risk in the supply chain. What role would you say that the modern procurement function has in mitigating that risk?
So I think procurement's got an essential role in mitigating risk. I think as part of a cross-functional team, procurement can play a really key role because they've got access to key pieces of data, the ability to analyse that data and provide insight proactively as to the risks that an organisation might be facing. And I think the other key advantage that a procurement function brings to an organisation looking to mitigate risk is once those issues are identified, procurement plays a key role in working with its trading partners within the supply chain to take action to support their organisation. And I think the willingness of the supply chain to respond to a customer is very much dependent on the relationships that have been developed by the customer with its supply chain. And the previous speaker was talking about the importance of that degree of collaboration, because procurement plays such a key role in positioning an organisation as a customer of choice. Suppliers are under such pressures right now to meet the requirements of such a broad range of customers. It's going to be those organisations that are collaborative, make themselves easy to do business with, are willing to engage in innovation, share insight around their future business plans, that when it comes to the crunch of a big risk issue and procurement and the organisation comes knocking for support, those organisations will respond to those quickest that are great customers to do business with, and procurement plays a key role in that for me.
Yeah, I agree. We had sessions yesterday, I'm just thinking of ones from Daniel Weiss and Geraint John as well, where they were identifying the role that procurement can play in effectively looking into the future, if you like. I mean, I realise that sounds a little bit vague, but they can identify those grey rhino events that Daniel Weiss was talking about to see where these problems are going to occur, but also, even if those problems don't occur, seeing where the weaknesses are in the existing supply chain. And that's something like additive manufacturing can certainly help with that. Tom, coming back to you, how clear a picture do you think C-suiters have of the problems facing their supply chains? Because we're talking about, you know, everyone here thinks they've got a clear idea, but the C-suite, do they really understand that?
I think they understand it an awful lot better now than they did certainly 3 or 4 years ago. I think COVID has been a game changer in C-suite understanding the importance of supply chain. I remember when I started my career, one of my bosses telling me, Tom, you're doing a great job if no one knows what you're doing and the supply chain's just working, which I think is sort of true. But actually, you do need to understand the risks as a board because you should be planning for them. And I think, you know, one of the things I found interesting is over the last 2 or 3 years, most big companies, I think, have rethought, have I got the right supply chain? Is it doing the right things? Does it have the right people? Does it have the right technology? And they're asking that question around the C-suite, which I think is opening up great opportunities for people in this room to say, actually, this is how we should be doing things better. I think there's been more investment in the supply chain in most of my clients in the past couple of years than probably the 10 years before that, because people have realised it's part of their business and they need to have business continuity to offer products. So I think it is raising up. My fear always is in 5 years' time, everyone's forgotten about COVID COVID, and we go back to having to beg for money to put more resilience in, rather than people thinking, actually, that is a sensible thing to do to make sure I can cover things. So I think it's all about us making sure that visibility is there of the risks so that the C-suite really understand it. And that to me is the job of the people in the supply chain, to make sure they're really clear on what their key risks are and how those need to be mitigated.
Yeah, you mentioned visibility there. I mean, Andrea, what's your view on the importance of visibility to mitigate supply chain risk?
Yeah, if you think 1 year ago, the evergreen container cargo blocked the Suez Canal. What happens was in the news. So basically, not only one container ship was blocked, but the hundreds of container ships were blocked from moving from south to north, from north to south. With thousands of containers, with billions of goods on board. And every company was asking, do I have any container on one of these ships? Or if yes, what are the orders? What are the customers? Or what are the facilities that are waiting for those goods? So no visibility in such an event is the worst that can happen. And today, more and more customers are, thanks to technology, are increasing their visibility. For example, thanks to geolocation, using connection with satellites for the ships, or with telematics on board with the trucks, so they know exactly where a specific box, a specific container is on the way to destination. Or they map completely the relation between orders, deliveries, items, and container, and they can analyze from a container exactly what are the orders in this specific container. But the new frontier is the prediction. So we have a lot of data today. And we can use technologies like artificial intelligence or other algorithms to understand what will be an impact of a delay. So a delay means having a new estimated time of arrival and replan all the activities on the value chain, basically. And this is something more and more important. So moving from the real-time data to the prediction of data. So more companies are using technologies to work on prediction in today's time.
Yeah, that's great. No, it is great. But this obviously involves an investment, right? So let's say a company looks at their finances and their current business, thinks we can only afford to digitally transform one facet of our supply chain, just in theory. Where would you advise them to start?
So just before I come back, I was going to come back to the point that Tom raised and the visibility point, because I was thinking to myself, I think the range of risks is so broad right now. It's super hard for C-suites to have a position on that, which is why visibility is so crucial. We were talking just before, weren't we, about the whole range of risks that organisations are facing right now, and you've got the terrible conflict in Ukraine right now, which we hope will come to an end soon, but the impact that's having on energy prices, affecting energy-intensive industries, through to food prices in the future as well. I mean, one of the key risks that we were talking about as well that's predicted for 2025 is that 2/3 of the world will be facing significant water shortages, which will impact how industrial operations can run that are reliant on the supply of water, through to levels in rivers, which will affect the ability for cargo to move through those particular routes. So I think the range of risks that we have today and we'll face in the future will be ever increasing. And coming back to where to invest first, if you're starting a supply chain transformation, my recommendation would be to start with your data first of all, to make sure that's clean and in good order, because that then enables you to progress with the analysis of that data, which will allow you where to focus and prioritize to allow the organisation to make decisions internally, but then crucially, and this is really crucial, to get outside of the four walls of the organisation and communicate and collaborate on those decisions and recommendations with the trading partners within your supply chain, so they can support the plan that you've put in place based on your clean data, great analysis, and recommendations you want to make in the future that align to what the organisation is trying to achieve through its vision and strategy. So that'd be my recommendation. Lead with data first of all.
And can I just add to that, Richard, because I agree with you completely. I think data often is the place to start. I think what you too often see is people invest on the last crisis they had rather than the next crisis. So I think it's always worth taking that step back and saying, am I just doing this because my problem last year was I couldn't get semiconductors? So I'm going to invest all my risk mitigation in getting more semiconductors. Well, that will probably sort itself out. Supply and demand normally does. So actually, the crucial question to ask is, why couldn't I respond to semiconductor crisis? Generally because I hadn't predicted it well enough, and I thought they would always be there. And people, when the COVID fell away, when COVID happened, they didn't think there'd be a big jump in consumer electronics. There's a whole load of things that went on. But actually, what were the key capabilities you didn't have that meant you couldn't respond? And that's where you should invest. And often it's data. And I find it really interesting for the semiconductor piece, because when the car manufacturers said, oh, COVID's coming, people aren't going to sell as many cars, we'll cancel all our semiconductors because we don't want too much stock of them and they go obsolete quite quickly. They didn't think, oh, but the factories that are making those semiconductors are also making them for mobile phones and computers, which are going to have a massive jump in demand. And as soon as we give up our preferred slots in those factories, we're not going to be able to get them back, and therefore we won't be able to make any cars. They didn't go through that thought process because they didn't see the Apples and the HPs and the Dells as their competitors. But actually, that's where we need to think a bit broader when we approach risk, rather than just responding to the last microcosm of an incident. And usually data's behind that, because actually the problem was their data didn't look broadly at what those factories were making and who their customers were.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. I mean, the impression I'm getting from you, Tom, here is that too many organisations are completely reactive rather than being strategic and long-term. You mentioned earlier about, a sudden investment right now in some of the technology, for instance, and you're saying, in a few years' time that might wane as they decide their priorities lie elsewhere. But do you think that companies in general need to have that longer-term view and be more strategic? And does that all come from the data?
I mean, the answer is yes, but it's really, really difficult. I think the problem is, you've usually got to solve this year's problems, and as Sherry said earlier, brilliantly, people worry about this year's profit, don't they? That's usually the number one question you get in any board meeting. But actually, it's about what's the 5-year view. And certainly with technology investment, I think you do need to look that longer place out there and make that case over the longer term. And, data's a key part of that, because if you don't have that long-term data, it's difficult. But what I would say is a lot of this is about scenarios, in my view. It's about saying, what are the supply chain scenarios that could play out, and can I model those? Because I think at quite a high level, you can look 5 to 10 years out, as long as you don't try and get into every microcosm.
Okay. Andrea, coming back to you, I'm keeping half an hour on time. Actually, let's see if there's any questions from the floor before I move on here. Yes, could we get the microphone just down to the front here, please, Richard? And if you can just start just by saying your name and where you're from, please.
Hi, Jay Doyle from ITV. Do you think the markets, so investors and shareholders, have had a role to play here because they've driven boards, for listed companies at least, to look at short-term financial return rather than resilience? And do you see markets changing and investor appetite changing and more value being placed on resilient businesses?
Are you looking at me first? Or?
We're all looking at you, Tom, yeah.
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think we can broadly paint the picture, but I think there's some companies that have always invested in resilience and done great jobs at it, and I think a lot of it does also depend on industry. But I think generally people have realised through some of the challenges we've had in the last few years that resilience is worth investing in, because if you don't, you've got nothing to sell and potentially not got a business. So I'm certainly seeing my clients are asking me a lot more questions about it, and I perceive they're asking those questions because they're being asked it by their investors and their owners. So I think it has been raised in profile, and you only need to read the papers to know that. I mean, it used to be quite rare that you had an article about supply chain in a mainstream paper or on the ITV news, for example. Now it's quite common, so I think there has been a raised awareness generally, and I think that's good because it'll allow people to do the trade-offs in a more balanced manner.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you can't turn on the news and not hear about supply chain or procurement in one way or another. And that's something that's only happened really in the last 2 or 3 years. It might have been previously, every now and again, you might hear about a shortage of something, but you wouldn't have that phrase supply chain and have that understanding of it as well. But going back to the Suez Canal thing quickly, I think it was yesterday Jonathan Kohlhauer from UST said the Suez Canal's been blocked 5 times. It's not like this is the first time this has happened. And this was a recurring theme from yesterday as well, that a lot of these events, while perhaps unexpected, it's not like they were unprecedented. You know, these things have happened. So do you think it's just because we've grown over-reliant on some of those trade routes, for instance, so like the Suez? It might have been blocked previously, but it's only now in 2021, or then in 2021, and on the back of everything else due to COVID, that it caused such impact. And is that all part of the whole planning that we need to do with procurement and supply chain anyway, to think we can't over-rely on this in case it does get blocked again? And is this the way things are moving?
Yeah, I think so. I think organisations now are looking at their current supply chains and thinking, you know, what have we learned from the past? And I think what's really a focus right now is the people side of being able to look at that supply chain and having great people within your teams that can identify the issues and plan out what action should be taken. So I think there's a slightly different topic, a real war on talent right now, and a real focus on having great people within your teams to help address these situations. And I think organisations are also using their supply chain networks to be able to look at, okay, what's our current pattern of supply chain, what are our options, and how agile and how quickly can we be to make a change to mitigate situations that you outlined with the with Suez Canal and similar incidents. So that's my perspective on things.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I remember someone said sort of back at the beginning of COVID, "Oh, just in time's dead." Well, it's not dead. Because it's still going to generally be a much more efficient way of running your supply chain. But you've just got to make sure that the bits of just in time where there is a really big risk, you've got a plan about how to address it. And it doesn't necessarily mean holding a load of stock there. It could be you've got a supplier down the road that can manufacture at 3 times the cost that's holding some capacity. There's lots of different ways you can do it. So I think to me, it's about just looking across that ecosystem and saying, actually, where is the risk and what's my way of mitigating it? And I always find it interesting because I do quite a lot of planning with factories about how they can get around various risks, to do with fire or, natural events, essentially. and quite often, the answer is the same regardless of what happens, because really what you need is flexibility, contingency, backup plans in place, and those things you can design without looking at all the specific risks and guessing them all right.
Okay, let's try and look a little bit into the future here, because as you said, there's no point dwelling on what's happened or doing that knee-jerk reaction and implementing things. We do need to be a bit more strategic and looking ahead. So let's say we're looking ahead to a window of 5 years' time. What risks do you see supply chain facing in 5 years? Andrea first.
Okay, if you think 5 years ago, what you were thinking, the risk, so everything that happens in the last 3 years was unexpected, okay? So for me, the key question is about supply chain. Do I have enough agility and speed to react to whatever happens in the future? So we have a COVID situation, we have a war blocking, we have sanction. Everything is happening, and also the differentiation of every company is how they react to these unexpected events. Okay, so for me, I have no crystal ball what will happen in 5 years, but nevertheless, it's key and crucial to be prepared. Somebody says the only constant is the change, and supply chain has to be prepared for the change.
I'd like to add a particularly important topic right now, which I think will increase in the future, which is the importance of organisations understand their risks around ESG and that particular topic, because we know that Norway and Germany have already passed legislation to ensure that companies understand that human rights are protected within their supply chains. We know that the US has taken action already to say that we will make the assumption that a particular province in China has human rights issues, and therefore we will not source anything from that particular region. And I think that will increase over time. Organisations will be under increased focus to understand how are human rights within your supply chain, how visible is that to you? And I think the second topic, which is important now and will increase in the future as well, will be understanding the level of Scope 3 carbon emissions within your supply chain. What are they? Because they're so much greater than the organisation itself, the production of that from your supply chain. What are they today? But not only understanding what they are, but what action are you going to take around that? And what have you actually done and what have you achieved over time? And I think it's those organisations, come back to the point around investors, that can demonstrate that we understand where we are with carbon, we've got a plan in place, and these are the actions that we've taken will be those that will resonate with consumers through to investors. And I'm seeing that in the customers that are talking to me now. Their priorities have changed greatly in the last year. A year ago it was, maybe costs were particularly. Now it's how do we address the ESG topic? How can you help us with that, SAP?
Yeah. And how do you?
I mean, I think it comes back, really, it's relatively similar. It's data and visibility are some of the biggest things in ESG. I mean, I know Sherry was talking earlier, but, there's some, these days you can see back down your supply chain. Yeah, it's quite difficult, to get that data, but it'll get easier through technology. And actually, as you get that visibility, people expect you to act on it. It won't be all right to say anymore, oh, I didn't know. Because if other companies know, well, you should know. So it's about how do you to get that right. And the other risk I would add to the ESG one, that just for the next 5 years, I think is the whole cyber piece. I think at the moment we do all look at it, but as factories become more connected, as in the future there will be a tracker on every good that moves around the world. Suddenly those could potential to be infected. You've also got, as AI starts to do more stuff, how do you know your AI's not being infected and doing the wrong things? So I do think over the next 5 years, cyber will become increasingly important. It's already important, but that would be one I wouldn't take your eye off.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well, because as we increasingly digitise, and there is this threat of cyber as well, are we generating more risk that we were trying to mitigate in the first place?
Potentially, you're just generating a different risk, aren't you? I don't think many people would go back to saying we shouldn't have computers because you get an email because you get spam. There's always a give and take, isn't there? So.
Okay. Any more questions from the floor? Yes, gentleman at the front. And if you just state your name and where you're from, please.
Thank you. Mark Fowler from a biotechnology company called Autolus. It's interesting the question you just posed around, what will the world look like in 5 to 10 years? What are the things we need to think about? And if you look backwards, there's been an incredible move towards globalization over the last, 10, 15 years, and offshoring and now nearshoring, and things seem to be coming back to a little bit more of a localized, risk management strategy. And I'm just interested the panel's view on if you think people will go into this to reduce risk in supply chains and localize more things, and then take more conscious decisions of where they're not localizing for financial or other benefits, supply chain benefits. But I'm just interested in this balance between globalization and localization and how this will play out over the next 5 to 10 years. Carbon as well, of course, because flying goods around the world, just on paper, it looks more efficient and cost effective. But the reality is costs are going up in traditional low-cost countries, and the risks are increasing, whether it's from environmental or cost, the unknowns around costs of fuel, etc. So, what's the panel's view?
Who wants to go first?
I think you're right. People are thinking about it a lot more now. I think, though, will the globalization genie get put back in the bottle? It won't, because there's lots of things it's much more efficient to make in fewer places around the world. Semiconductors is a great example. Do I think the UK will ever be self-sufficient in semiconductors? No, I don't, because that probably would never happen. But will people look at it more and take more balance? And I think what they will do is look at actually the trade-offs between risk and cost and agility is probably one of the biggest ones. And I think it's also be a lot more driven by consumers. I think the thing, I find interesting now is consumers are more often saying, certainly my wife's a great example. When we go to the supermarket, she doesn't want to buy any food that's got air miles on it. So we just don't buy fruit and veg from other parts of the world if they're not in the season in Europe. Now, I think there's lots of people that make that choice. And as people make that choice, supply chains have to follow it. So I think it will change, and I think people are getting much more educated. And so I think we need, as professionals, to be able to respond to that and say, yeah, we've really thought it through. And I'd be more expected to be asked the question by your colleagues or your board to say, actually, what is the trade-off here? And if you don't know the trade-off, that's an awkward place to be in.
I think just to add to that, I think many organisations have moved, as Tom was saying, from a just-in-time level of inventory to a just-in-case level of inventory. And many organisations that I work with are holding very high levels of inventory to try and protect themselves from risk. But actually, of course, there's risk within that because materials are going out of date, obsolete, whatever reason. So I think that many organisations are using their ability to analyse their supply chains, look at their supply chain network to look at more local sources of supply, but not just because it's local, but for particularly important reasons that they want to support particular parts of their economy. It may be a particular region, it may be a particular group in the population that the organisation has said, I commit to support that group and I want to source my business towards that. And we get asked quite a lot to do analysis around our SAP business network in terms of what suppliers do you have available in this particular region? We'd like to target that. Or which minority-owned suppliers do you have available? Or which companies are owned by a particular group that we would like to support? Because organisations are very conscious now about being more targeted as to where they're sourcing things. And I would say the general trend is to become more local, but particularly focused around not just local, but also themes that are really important to the organisation, and in particular what investors and backers are asking of them too.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. If anyone, I know we didn't get to address all of the questions that came through, unfortunately, but if anyone does want to reach out, obviously you can reach out to these guys if you're physically here in London. If you're not, if you use the event app, then you can ask any questions to all of our speakers directly as well. But for now, thank you to our panel. Thank you, guys. Thank you.